Okay, we are live. So, Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 10th session of Ideas Conclave. My name is Raza, and we have a very special guest here tonight with us. Joining from Virginia, we have the Distinguished Fellow of the Atlantic Council, the founding South Asia Director, uh, and Mr. Shuja Nawaz, an author of two books, most recently The Battle for Pakistan. He has also written some, he has also some uh, verse fiction published, but we will be focusing on his non-fiction work right here. He's also worked for the New York Times, the World Health Organization, and has headed three separate divisions at the International Monetary Fund. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out the time here for our students tonight.
Thank you very much, Raza, and Assalamu alaikum to everyone watching in Pakistan and wherever else you may be at the end of Facebook's reach around the globe. I'm really delighted to connect with an audience primarily of youth because I believe the future belongs in your hands, and your questions will help me shape a lot of my thinking in this period of my life when I think it's important to hand over to you so that you can do whatever you want with this world and with Pakistan.
Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Shuja Nawaz is going to be directly addressing the students for the first few minutes, and then we'll start our question and answer session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you again, Raza. I thought I'd say a few words about the book just to get those who have not yet read it hopefully interested enough to take a look at it or dip into it as it is designed for dipping into. The book is called The Battle for Pakistan. The subtitle is The Bitter US Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood. And it deals with primarily the US-Pakistan relationship from 2008 till now. It is based largely on my own involvement in policy discussions as well as field research that I was doing in the region during this period. And when I say in the region, it means conversations with leaders in not just the United States and Europe, and particularly Great Britain, but also with Afghan leaders, with Indian leaders, as well as in Pakistan. And I was lucky enough to work closely with civil and military leaders during this period. And so I have a box full of notebooks from the period of my notes, from contemporaneous notes from that period, as well as interviews that I'd conducted during that period, which I've taken advantage of. I then went back to many of the leading figures that were available for actual interviews, and I was very gratified that a very large proportion of them, something like 80% of the people that I approached, were prepared to sit down for on-the-record interviews, which I taped and have transcripts from, and which I could then meld with my earlier contemporaneous notes and recollections and my research and fresh documentation that had often not seen the light of day. And so this is my modest and humble attempt at trying to understand what happened, and through that, hoping that others will understand what happened, or if not, then raise much more pertinent questions and find answers. I'm very grateful to the people that sat down for the interviews and that helped me during this period, and also to those that read the initial very long draft and asked questions and made suggestions, which allowed me to then edit down my own first rambling draft to a shorter version, so that this book, for those who have seen my earlier book, Cross Swords, is not as thick as Cross Swords, so nothing to fear. It can be read relatively easily. I do want to mention that there are 3 editions of the book. The first edition is a South Asia edition that came out from Penguin Random House, but then the Kashmir issue arose and the India-Pakistan border was shut down. So Penguin made an arrangement with Liberty Publishing in Pakistan to produce a Pakistan edition, roughly a year ago that was released. And I was then in Pakistan for the launch of that edition. Unfortunately, the military chief had difficulties with the launch during that period because his extension was up in the courts. And so the launches were canceled by the military and I returned. Then I came back to the United States and worked with my US and world publisher, which is Roman and Littlefield. And we brought out an updated edition, which is available everywhere in the world except in South Asia. And for those of you that have not seen that, this is the cover of that book. It has a different cover. It has a note about what happened in Pakistan last December, and also an epilogue that brings the story much more up to date in terms of what's happening in Pakistan, as well as what is happening in what I have been referring to as Trumpistan over the last few years. So what I'm going to try and do is give you some of the key points that emerge from the book. This is in no way an attempted summary of the book. The book has many individual chapters that deal with critical hinge factors in this US-Pakistan relationship, as well as with the what I call misalliance, the unequal marriage between the civil and the military in Pakistan during this period. First of all, Afghanistan. It continued to be the key factor that was driving the US-Pakistan relationship. And in my view, unfortunately, it continues to be that factor. And it has drawn away from much more important reasons for the US and Pakistan to work together in the region and for Pakistan to play its role as a stabilizing factor and as the Eastern bulwark, as it were, of the Muslim world in the Middle East and in Central Asia. The Afghanistan War was described by President Obama when he came into office as the necessary war, but it soon became the forever war. And it is only now, after having made a campaign promise that he would bring the boys home, President Trump is now trying to get as many of them back before he actually hands over power on January 20th to President-elect Joseph Biden. This war marked by a massive problem, which was that the United States kept shifting the goalposts in terms of what it wanted to do. During this period, 19 years, they had 19 different commanders. The average tenure of each commander was about 13 months. And as a result, even the military was fighting on different fronts and kept changing the way they operated. And there was constant debate and discussion inside Washington and with the coalition partners on what they wanted to do. In my book, I also go back to the beginning, which is the first US invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. And I uncover the story which General Jim Mattis told me, where he and I had worked together when he was CENTCOM commander, and he was on a visit to Washington one testifying on the Hill, came back to the office, and while we were talking, he shared with me a story of how he was the first naval officer as a brigadier general who had been given command of a naval. He was the first Marine officer as a brigadier general who'd been given command of a naval expeditionary force, which is Task Force 58. That was supposed to go and put boots on the ground in Afghanistan in support of the 10 CIA teams that had been infiltrated right after the 9/11 attacks to prepare the grounds for a US invasion. Jim Mattis came to Pakistan. He went to the Joint Chiefs headquarters, talked to the Director General Operations there, and then worked out with people in Pakistan an arrangement under which the Marines landed at Pasni and then were kept under cover of darkness or under tents at the Pasni airstrip, from where they were then bused to Jacobabad and then eventually flew to what was known as Objective Rhino, about 100 kilometers southwest of Kandahar, because they saw Kandahar as the center of gravity of the Taliban leadership. And this was going to be the first primary objective. Center of gravity takes me to the next point, which was that there was a lack of center of gravity of decision making in the United States about the war. General Doug Lute, who was the person in charge of the region in the National Security Council in the Bush administration, in the transition to the Obama administration, told me that he had a PowerPoint deck that he called 10 wars. So essentially, the United States was fighting 10 different wars inside Afghanistan. It wasn't the cohesion nor the clarity of purpose that is required of any military operation or any political operation or civil military cooperation. There was a similar lack of clarity and lack of a center of gravity inside Pakistan because of the misalliance that I mentioned before. The unequal relationship between the civil and the military meant that they were never on the same page, even though this is something that they said publicly and to me on many occasions. But as I wrote in a paper for the US Institute of Peace, if they were on the same page, it was in different books. This was a rather flip way of presenting it, but that's an underlying reality that affected the manner in which Pakistan contributed or failed to contribute to the success of this effort, which is why the necessary war remained the forever war. The other thing is this, that in the process of dealing with Pakistan, the United States, especially under President Bush and then more under President Obama, managed to dehyphenate the India-Pakistan relationship. So they had a separate track and a good relationship with India that started developing based not only on military alliances and sales of equipment to India, but also on increasing trade, as well as investment in India and from India in the United States by the growing Indian business community. That hyphenation continued because the US, for the first time in its history, had a positive relationship with the government in Afghanistan, as well as with Pakistan. This dehyphenation is now being rehyphenated, and this is because of Kashmir, because like it or not, the United States is going to have to deal with the issue of Kashmir and deal with India publicly or privately in order to help resolve it and remove it as an irritant in the regional relationships. The other big lesson I learned from studying this period in depth and talking to people who knew more than me about it was that United States aid only works when there is a strategy that is long-term and that is underlying the aid program, and that it connects with the people of the country to whom you're giving the money. It fails when you're trying to get something in return from the government or from the military or from other interested parties, because then it becomes purely transactional and they see it as transactional too. And then it just becomes a game in which neither side comes out ahead. Now, throughout this period and going forward, I see an enormous challenge for Pakistan domestically. It's tied to militancy, it's tied to regional terrorism and unrest. And in the past, the state was involved in sponsoring some groups that it used for its extraterritorial pressure in Kashmir. For instance, after the end of the war in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Most of those groups, or many of them, have now become fairly independent financially and otherwise. And they are now striking out on their own. And there is no clearly enunciated policy or plan for de-radicalization or de-weaponization. Everybody talks about it, but like the weather, people talk about it and they haven't done anything about it. This is an unfinished business of Pakistan's involvement with the Soviet jihad. It's now the remaining unfinished business of Pakistan's involvement in the American war in Afghanistan. And as I'm sure people, particularly in Pakistan, know, the economic challenges remain enormous for Pakistan. And this is on top of what I consider to be a weak polity, because you have this imbalance with domestically between the civil and the military. You also have an imbalance in the size of the provinces. And as a result, many of the things that would be eliminated in terms of what I call the centrifugal forces that are afflicting Pakistan today, that tend to make the center and the periphery relationship difficult, um, could be eliminated by having a much more balanced structure, maybe along the Afghan line, maybe along the Nigerian lines, with more provinces, each one responsible for its activities, especially following the amendment under which you had a devolution of power to the provinces. The critical thing for Pakistan in this process will be to strengthen the centripetal forces. These are the forces that hold the country together. And Pakistan's great advantage is the mobility of its people. Karachi, for instance, represents a microcosm of the population of Pakistan. And it's critical that the open economic and trade relationships that exist between the current provinces remain a key part of it. I've traveled often to India, and I can tell you how difficult it is to trade across state boundaries inside India. There are long lines at every crossing point and all kinds of antiquated taxes and other tariff and non-tariff barriers that come into play. So Pakistan will need to fix its economy. It will need to go out from the current hole that it is in, largely because of the COVID-19 crisis, but also largely because of unkept promises to reform the economy and to reduce the power of government and reduce the power of the bureaucrats who sit in Islamabad, so that decisions can be made closer to home by the provincial authorities and by businesses working in tandem with the local authorities. So from a negative 0.04% growth rate of last year to maybe something in the most optimistic scenario of the Asian Development Bank, close to 2%, Pakistan needs to go to 7 to 10% in that range in order to get ahead of the curve and in order to create 1 million new jobs a year. It has been losing jobs every year. India faces the same problem. But we don't have to look at India and say that they're in the same boat. Pakistan needs to look at itself and find how it can get out of these difficulties. Now, in the United States, which is also facing an enormous economic challenge, Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize winner at Yale, the economics prize winner, predicted that the United States will not come out of the COVID-19 economic hole till 2024, which is a long time. And the US has a very strong underlying economy. My own understanding from looking at Pakistan and looking at the lack of movement on institutional reform and development is that Pakistan will need another 10 years at least in order to come out of this hole. So it's going to be rough sledding, and there needs to be a vision that is over the horizon. There will continue to be an abiding mistrust between the United States and Pakistan. They continue to have different objectives, and we wait to see for a much more informed and experienced foreign policy team to come into the Biden administration. I'm delighted that I know many of them and have worked with them, and they will be in key positions, and that President Biden, who knows the region well from his earlier position as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as the vice president, and as President Obama's point man for many of the key issues dealing with the region, dealing with Afghanistan, dealing with Iran, dealing with Pakistan, dealing with Saudi Arabia and India, that he'll be able to come together with a much more coherent and sustainable political and economic relationship with the region. Our aim should be to revisit the past, not to criticize it, but to learn from it. Because it's not criticism for the sake of criticism, but to seek the right possible path ahead. And what we don't want to do is what Pakistan has traditionally done, which is to look at the short run and try and muddle through, because that is not a recipe for success. I'm sure that you will have many questions and also answers for what needs to be done. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for walking us through the many things that you've mentioned in your book and giving us a brief introduction into Pakistan's main problems and challenges Pakistan has faced and potentially faces. You've titled your book The Battle for Pakistan, the Bitter US Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood. Before coming into the internal battles, so-called, as you even put a chapter on it in your book, I'd like to talk about the US-Pakistan relationship that, and there's a very interesting sentence that you write in the very introduction, that you started writing this book as a Pakistani, but you ended it as an American. So you have this vantage point. And the Pakistan-US relationship is often called a bad marriage, an alliance that does not have lacks mutual trust. Some people call it a forced marriage that is based on shared interests rather than shared values. How do you see about the Pakistan-US relationship, and not just over the years, but where it stands right now?
I think it's at an inflection point, particularly with the incoming administration. And as I hinted in my remarks at the end, I have much more hope that the incoming administration, just so you know, very interesting that there's something like 2,000 persons who have been associated from the foreign policy side in some way or the other with the Biden transition team. So that is an extremely deep bench, as they say in American sports parlance. This is your reserve. And with such an enormous reserve, decision-making can only be better. Of course, it'll be noisy, and there will be efforts to influence particular players. But I think that you'll have a White House that will be in much greater command of the situation. The NSC will go back to its traditional role of being a coordinator rather than making decisions and policies on its own. And with President Biden's previous knowledge and experience of working with his colleagues on the Hill, particularly on the Republican side, if they continue to maintain a majority in the Senate, he will be able to pull together, kicking and screaming, the Republicans into an American policy that is of benefit to the world at large. Another key difference that I see is that there will be much more consultation with different partners in different regions of the world. So the European alliance is going to be strengthened. The alliance with Pakistan could be strengthened if Pakistan plays its role. As you were saying, any relationship in the foreign policy realm is based on self-interest. I say it's based on enlightened self-interest. So if it is simply based on blind self-interest, then you have two opposite forces butting heads, and that doesn't help anyone. I think Pakistan needs to make decisions that work in its favor, but it needs to make them in a transparent way and help the American leadership understand why it's doing and what it's doing and how they can work together to that end, rather than keeping some cards close to its chest and playing the other cards and hoping that the Americans will not notice. I have a very telling episode in the book where a US ambassador is talking to a DG of the ISI, and the US ambassador says to the DG ISI, you think you can fool the Gora all the time. And he used the word Gora in the interview with me. And I said, what was the response? And he said, there was a kind of embarrassed silence and a smile, and then a very murmured yes from the DG ISI. I think both sides understand what was going on, but they had short-term goals. that forced them to stay together. And I call the book The Battle for Pakistan because it is not the battle of Great Britain, Second World War. It is the battle for the future and the soul of Pakistan. And the only people that can really win that are in Pakistan. We don't have to blame the foreigners. We don't have to hold them responsible for what's good or what's bad. Everything has to emerge from within the country, which has the resources, the people, the middle class, the business community. It has the money. The economy is, 50% of the economy is informal, underground, not captured by the tax net. And so you have to see how you can bring all of this together.
So I think there's an issue with your audio.
I just stopped there, and I think your image was frozen. So let's continue.
Yeah. So you were talking about the incident where the DGISI, the exchange between DGISI and the US ambassador, and the embarrassed silence that ensued in the room.
Okay, well, let me repeat, the US ambassador says that he asked the DGISI, so you think that you can fool the Gora all the time.
Yeah.
The DGISI paused for a little while, a little embarrassed, and then said yes, because they understood each other.
Yeah. So, Seb, you mentioned this very interesting thing about the U.S. foreign policy being now returning to the expansionist sort of role that it had receded under the Trump administration. And from your conversation, I can infer that that decisions that the U.S. made for the betterment of the world, that there's this sense I get that you see US still being a force for good and holding that mantle of global leadership. But we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 20 years, be it Afghanistan, be it Iraq, be it Libya, and if we go back into the 80s, that more times than not, the United States has not been, the US intervention has not been good news for at least the people living in those countries. So do you feel that in 2020, entering 2021, when President-elect Biden will take charge, we should hope for the US, or we should aspire for US leadership that again wants to intervene in and meddle in affairs of countries in the name of peace?
I don't support, and neither do I, in my analysis, point to a greater interventionist role by the United States across the globe. So let me be clear about that. I don't want the United States to be seen as a global policeman. And I don't think that many of the incoming leadership, whether elected or selected by President Biden to work with him in different key positions, favor that kind of an approach. The big difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is going to be the ability of the United States to consult with its allies around the globe and to take their views on board before it decides to take any action. The other thing is going to be consistency and predictability. That in the Trump administration, decision-making appeared to be whimsical. And the institutional structures that support sound, sustainable, consistent, predictable decisions, especially in the foreign policy realm, were replaced by whimsical, ill-informed tweets at 3 a.m. from the White House. I think that is going to be a huge change and a big relief for the partners of the United States. Jim Mattis, in one of his testimonies on the Hill, explained to the senators that if you don't strengthen your diplomacy and you don't consult with friends, abroad, then I'm going to have to ask you for more money in order to get more troops, because that's the only tool that will be left to us. And the hallmark of any good military leader is that he doesn't wish to use his troops and his weapons ever. Having them is enough as a deterrence and as a defense, but nobody really wants to go to war because war has all kinds of other consequences.
Yeah. So we'll just stick to the US front here because A, because of your vantage point, and B, you extensively mentioned the book is essentially themed around the Pak-US relationship. In your chapter,
I've lost your audio now.
the choices where you essentially talk about the choice. So can you hear me?
Right.
Your screen's
Yes.
okay. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in your chapter, the choices where you talk about the choices that Pakistan is potentially faced with in the coming years, your emphasis is on Pakistan coming out of the shadows of China and taking on initiatives that perhaps to some extent counter the Belt and Road Initiative in form of a Grand Trunk Road Initiative. Or and you've written the sentence that it is critical for Pakistan to not replace China with the US and the West. And so the feeling that I get, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel that US is still Pakistan's, for the lack of a better word, the more preferred ally in your opinion than China as its primary friend in the global arena.
I am a supporter of a balanced relationship. I don't think it should be an either or situation. I don't think it behoves Pakistan to drop the relationship with the United States. And I don't think that there are people in Pakistan in the civil and in the military who want to do that. Because there is a long and deep relationship with the Chinese. There is now a developing economic relationship that promises all kinds of benefits. And when I suggest a new initiative, which I call the new Grand Trunk Road Initiative, I'm suggesting in addition to CPEC, and in fact, almost serving as partly as a tributary to CPEC, because it would connect Central Asia through Afghanistan to Pakistan and then on to India and Bangladesh. And that is a very natural flow. And when trade dependencies are created between the countries of what I call Greater South Asia, and I should also mention, if the US sanctions are removed, the threat of sanctions is removed, then the Iran, Pakistan, India pipeline becomes a practicable proposition. This will only benefit the region and the world. And it will also reduce some of the tensions between China and the United States, because China now has a much more expansive investment in Iran and in creating north-south links between Iran and China through Central Asia and through Afghanistan. So I believe that interconnectedness is critical for the region, and Pakistan should do whatever it can on its own volition to open up the neighborhood and to remove these barriers that are being created, particularly on its eastern border, by a government that is resorting to pandering to the right wing. Because the moment that right wing rises in India, you will find similar right-wing forces in Pakistan taking advantage of that and saying, see what we told you, we have to be in greater position. And you'll have the kind of dharnas and the unrest that you may have seen in the last few days, for instance, on the streets of Islamabad and Rawalpindi.
Yeah. So, sir, you mentioned this point in your book as well, and that is about the popularity of the United States as an ally, as a Pakistani ally, or as a Pakistani friend within Pakistan. At its peak, only around 26, 27% people in Pakistan viewed the United States favorably. Whereas with China, even though there are allegations of concentration camps in southwestern parts of China, there is not as big a stronger resistance, or a sentiment of hostility towards China. If anything, CPEC is hailed as the next big thing that could save Pakistan's economy. So, how do you see this sort of this dichotomy? Wali Nasser, in his book The Dispensable Nation, writes mentions of an exchange between Hina Rabbani Khan and Richard Holbrooke in Istanbul, where the Pakistani foreign minister says that perhaps the big reason why the Pakistani people are not able to associate the US for some of the good things that they've done is because there's nothing tangible out there. There's no road, monument, or a university, so to speak, that the US has funded. Whereas, reading your book, I learned that, the US had done a lot of work during the earthquake relief fund. But if you go to Azad Kashmir, if you go to the northern areas, there are buildings in red that have been donated that are, denoting Turkish donation to the Kashmiri government, but there is nothing concrete, as so to speak, that you could see that the US has done in those regions. It has all of the support that there has been, the money that has been. It is, you can't put a finger to it, or point towards something tangible out there. Is this perhaps the reason, or is there something deeper?
Well, I do cover this at some length in different chapters dealing with the military-to-military relationship, as well as on US aid. And one of the key factors in that is this. And something that I was involved in the presentation of a comprehensive new US policy towards Pakistan that was presented in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee room by me for the Atlantic Council in February 2009. And many of those very specific suggestions remained unfilled. We had exchanges with Ambassador Holbrooke. We agreed on so many things that needed to be done. Unfortunately, he passed away. And Senator Kerry, when he became the Secretary of State, did not have anyone who could pull things together with the ability of Holbrooke and rush them through different parts of the US government. And I recall an exchange with him when he was leaving as Secretary of State. At the State Department, there was an event for a retiring ambassador. And I reminded him of that report, which he had co-sponsored with Chuck Hagel for us. And he agreed that they had not been able to go down the list. Going back to people in Pakistan who saved the United States, I rely on the Pew poll. And the Pew polls say, in answer to one question, that the majority of Pakistanis, which is over 60%, actually want improved relations with the United States. And I've been trying to suggest to Pew that they should unpack the answer to this question. Why do you want better relations with the United States? It's not a question of either or, that the Chinese are worse or the Americans are worse. Pakistan needs to have an economic and trade relationship with neighbors like China and India and Afghanistan and Iran. But the United States is an ancient trade partner and the largest trade partner of Pakistan. So it's critical for that relationship to remain on an even keel. Now, the US did assist Pakistan in getting the Mangla Dam, the Tarbela Dam, the Warsak Dam. It assisted with creation of LUMS. It assisted in rejuvenating the former Christian College in Lahore. And it gave Pakistan its very first research reactor at Nellore. Among so many other things that it did, Unfortunately, the US is now out of the business of infrastructure. So there is nothing that's a signature project. There's nothing tangible out there that people can point to and say, our friends in the United States gave that and we are benefiting from it. It was frittered away. The $7.5 billion of the Kerry Lugar Berman bill that Senator Biden had originally authored, but he became the vice president, so it didn't carry his name. 2 billion remained undispersed to this day, and they've been reprogrammed. And the rest, according to Robin Rafel, who was the aid coordinator in Pakistan, we were doing an event just this Monday. She said, and I use her word, she said it was frittered away. So the US is partly responsible, but Pakistan as the recipient is also responsible because it saw this as easy money rather than work with the United States and come up with plans that are long-term and practicable and in sectors that will create additional value for Pakistan over time.
Yeah, and even to this day, Pakistan, the US remains the largest export market for Pakistan, majorly because of the sheer size of its economy, but also because the markets in Pakistan and the businesses in Pakistan have established their links with the US markets over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And then there's also the military dependence, so to speak, of the Pakistani military dependence on US on buying US equipment and how we work. There's a very strong perception that Pakistan would never completely go into the Chinese camp, primarily because perhaps our military cannot afford to de-link itself from the US. And how true is that, given that you are kind of considered an authority in Pakistan military here?
Let me put it this way, and my knowledge and authority on this subject comes from conversations with thoughtful and responsible military officials over time. And this has not changed. I think the volume of military assistance and cooperation with China has been on the increase, but the high quality weaponry and systems that are preferred by the Pakistani military and by militaries around the world generally tend to come from the United States. Why do you think India, which is the world's second largest importer of arms, wants to have this relationship with the United States? You don't want to be dependent on the exporting country, as Pakistan has learned to its discomfort over the years. Indeed, since the Trump administration came into power, since January of 2017, there has been no military assistance for Pakistan. The training is zero. So something like 200 plus officers used to be trained every year in the United States. The last 4 years, there was a gap. And this gap will be reflected in how eventually senior military officers in Pakistan will view the United States, because they will have had no exposure to it in the formative years of their service. These are all consequences. And I think thoughtful people in America are aware of it. And I'm hoping that thoughtful people in Pakistan are aware of it too. Just one word of warning, which is that in Pakistan, we tend to oscillate between very optimistic, wishful thinking on the one hand, and then a narrative of despair and victimhood on the other, that somehow the world is against us. And in Pakistan, it's very critical for Pakistan to be aware that it can formulate its own political and economic destiny. And what it does domestically and how it strengthens its polity and economy will affect its ability to influence neighbors near and far. And that includes China, it includes America, Britain, France, Germany, Australia, everyone.
I agree, sir. But then why do we hear General Asad Durrani, former DGISI, say that Pakistan and the US are at war? The late General Hamid Kul, he went on this tirade and was one of the leading figures again the anti-US, instigating the anti-US public opinion in Pakistan. People who have held high positions within the Pakistani military, that the anti-US sentiment did not flow from the street; it came from the top. Why do you feel people who've headed institutions that have been the biggest beneficiaries of Pakistan-American cooperation, coming out in the open and saying such stuff about
Well, you
their partners?
mentioned two names, and I have written and I've spoken to both of them, and I've interviewed them for my earlier book too. In terms of the late General Hamid Gul, whom I knew quite well, there were very strong reasons why he was very anti-American. It was not because of his tenure in the ISI, where he had a good relationship with his American counterparts. And he talked about that. We were on a Fareed Zakaria program once where he talked about it. But at the same time, he felt that maybe the Americans had spoken against him when his name had come up for selection as the army chief, and that he wasn't selected because of that. Of course, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar had written or spoken, given a verbal recommendation for him, and he referred to that. So there may be other reasons why he was presenting the way things were. General Durrani is a different case. And General Durrani was in the ISI, and he's had during a difficult period in the relationship with the United States. So he may have his own reasons. In the best of circumstances, the relationship between the ISI chief and the CIA has never been very smooth. And the reason for that is that there is so much distrust in that relationship. But it works extremely well, as I outline in my book, at very specific points of intersection. And so, for instance, one of the CIA station chiefs, former station chiefs, I quote him as saying that they were the best of partners and the worst of partners. They were the best in counterterrorism, but in other areas, they were the worst of partners. And that's because both sides held things away from each other. The other point that you raise is why do people have a negative view of the United States? It's because we had self-dealing and self-serving corrupt political leaders in Pakistan over the years. I'm not singling out any particular party. This is uniform, who continued to lie to the people of Pakistan about what was happening or not happening with the United States. The drones was the ideal example of that. Privately, and now the WikiLeaks has shown that, and my own conversations with people in the US administration and in Pakistan have shown it, they were cooperating with the United States on mounting drone attacks in selected areas, even down to which grids in North Pakistan could be attacked. And publicly, the Pakistan leadership, military and civil, was proclaiming loud and from the rooftops that the US was impinging on their sovereignty. And they were inflaming the public discourse in the hinterland. And that's very tough to remove once you've established it. And that is now the war cry of the right wing in Pakistan.
But, sir, is it fair to just blame the civilian leadership in this? Because you've mentioned this in your book as well, and anyone who looks closely at Pakistan's.
It is not fair, and I do blame the civil and the military leadership for this because they had their separate reasons. The military continues to prefer US military aid, but it uses its position inside the country for its own internal purposes also, and also vis-a-vis the civilian government. And so it's a triangular relationship that needs to be much more balanced. That is my suggestion.
So in your opinion, the OBL raid in May in Abbottabad, was it an example of US-Pakistan cooperation, or was it what you would call an abject failure in Pakistan? Was it a reflection of the mistrust that exists between the two intelligence agencies, the two militaries, and the two countries. Essentially, what I'm asking is, do you think Pakistan was aware of the military raid in Abbottabad, or did it get to know like any other Pakistani did on the news?
The results of my own research up to this point are reflected in my chapter 4
Yeah,
of
the
my
worst year.
book. And they indicate what has been said also, among others, as recently as today by the release of the new book by President Obama, that the Pakistanis cooperated up to a certain point in sharing intelligence, and Pakistan has acknowledged that they did. They provided some of the initial intelligence. They just weren't able to connect the dots. However, there were people inside Pakistan who actively, on their own volition, sold out to the United States. And I mention some of them in the book, serving officers. And now we discover that there may have been other senior serving officers, including one who has now been sentenced to 14 years rigorous imprisonment, who may also have been assisting the US or some other foreign power that has not been defined by the government of Pakistan or the military in Pakistan. So all of these factors came into play. The Pakistanis were aware of the US interest, but they obviously were not aware of what was going on and what was in the works. And General Kiani was called by Mike Mullen, Admiral Mullen, and according to a report by Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post, the CIA had their experts looking at the voice patterns in that conversation, as well as the conversation with General Pasha. And they indicated that there was actual surprise on the part of the Pakistani leadership, the military leadership, when they heard that Osama bin Laden was there. General Kiani told me, and I reflected in my book, that he thought that the attack, if it was a US attack, may be on a nuclear facility, perhaps a storage facility in that general region. And that's why he said he issued an executive order immediately to scramble F-16s to go after them. But there was a delay. And by the time 45 minutes had elapsed, the raid was done and they were on their way home, again using terrain-hugging radar to guide themselves back into safety. So there were all these factors at play. The fact that at least two colonels in charge of the intel battalion responsible for Rawalpindi and Islamabad were either directly or indirectly on the US payroll. And one of them now is in a home in San Diego that I managed to trace, indicate that, as General Pasha mentioned in the unreleased draft of the Abbottabad Commission inquiry, Pakistanis, like most people in most countries, are willing to betray their own country for a price. And sometimes the price is small.
Is this something, was this karma coming back at Pakistan? Because again, there's a senior military general who, sitting in the Oxford Union, proudly said that if you can't ride two horses, you have no business to join the circus. So Pakistan took, great pride in, riding two horses at the same time. And then, something like this happens in Pakistan. In Abbottabad, it's not the tribal regions. It's like, a few miles away from Islamabad. And then when one again comes to this question that, why is the US so unpopular here? Yes, people aspire to go to the United States for a better career, for better education. But when things like these are happening, when Raymond Davis shoots two people, you've mentioned in this chapter the 2011, the most horrible year you've called it. An American agent, no Chinese, Indian, or any agent. India is the only other country that comes close to this in terms of physical on ground involvement, violence. So doesn't the question answer itself then, that perhaps there is something that the Americans need to revisit in terms of Pakistan. And I'll just add one question to it, because when we were growing up, in the late 2000s and early 2010, there used to be this great talk about how the road to Islamabad goes through Washington, and the mention of three A's, Allah, America, and the army. So, but now in 2020, in the 2018 election, which was by far, I feel, in the last 12 years, the most contested election, whose results were so disputed by some major political parties, the American role, so to speak, is diminished in Pakistan's internal politics, at least on the public front. Do you see that as a sign of dwindling American influence in Pakistan, or is it just because the realities have changed?
The realities are constantly changing, and for any polity to survive the turbulence of change, it has to be sure-footed itself, which means it has to define its own purpose and its aim and strengthen those. Unfortunately, in Pakistan, you've had a very unbalanced polity, and we've talked about that in terms of the administrative makeup of the country, in terms of the imbalance of power between the civil and the military, and the fact that you have dynastic political parties that talk of democracy but don't have internal democracy within their own parties. So all of these factors do not create a great deal of respect among Pakistan's partners or erstwhile partners across the globe. And in the years that I've been active, particularly after I left the IMF and got into the think tank world, and I've been active in policy making circles in Europe, in Britain, as well as here and in the region, respect is something that I've talked about often, because you have to have fair, honor, and respect, to use Thucydides' tripartite kind of dictum. Without these, you can't have a good relationship. You talked of Abbottabad. I refer to it as the invasion of Pakistan. Before that, the United States forces actually invaded the border of Pakistan repeatedly, physically, at Angurada, at other places. And then on a daily basis, they were invading the airspace of Pakistan because they thought that Fatah was ungoverned territory and that they could do what they will. And now we discover through WikiLeaks that they were given permission to do that. And I've seen photographs of US and Pakistani officers looking at a drone being pushed out from a field onto the runway in Balochistan. So all of this was happening behind the scenes. So when you do this and you then have a public stance that the United States knows is wrong because you've been assisting them, then they lose respect for you. I think this is the price that Pakistan pays for the mistakes of its leadership, both political and military, and when they don't have a long-term vision at work. So you talked about the book and how I began writing it as a Pakistani. That will always be with me, the fact that I was born in Pakistan, grew up there, and I retained my citizenship till well after I left the IMF. So now as an American, I'm using whatever I can do in the corridors in Washington and on the Hill to help people understand why it's important for the US to maintain good friendships and reliable friendships and be consistent and predictable in the way it deals with countries, and to hold them accountable for the aid that you provide them so that they can become confident and do much more instead of simply complain and ask for more money or more weapons or whatever.
Yeah. I think we'll have just the last two questions here. Interesting that you mentioned in your book towards the end, and that is about how Pakistan's similarity to Egypt, that a failing civilian government would first, the first step to counter the feelings would be a soft coup, and then perhaps, God forbid, a hard coup. Do you see that analysis coming into reality in Pakistan, given where we are right now?
I think I only present the scenario of an Egypt on the Indus as a worst case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolute. That has to be a worst
I say
case.
that because I think there are thoughtful people in the military as well as on the civil side in Pakistan who can put their minds together and not separately reach this conclusion and look at the possibilities that exist to create a stronger Pakistan economy as well as polity. I'm very critical of the lack of interest publicly of the business community in Pakistan, which is extremely rich and powerful, but which is so used to an addiction on SROs and preferred access to state resources, etc., that it is not doing enough to meet its own capacity to generate economic returns within the country and within the neighborhood, and to influence decision making in Islamabad so that you create a much more conducive neighborhood and trade relationships with neighbors. I think the business community and the emerging middle class in a largely urbanized Pakistan could be the driving force for the future. And we can avoid the fate of Egypt, which has basically lived on international and US handouts for decades, and whose military is beholden to the United States forever. And they don't have any other options. I would not, I know Egypt well. I've traveled there. I've worked with people in Egypt. I launched the first Arabic edition of Finance and Development Economic Quarterly with Al-Aram Al-Iqtasadi, with Boutros Ghali, who later became foreign minister as the first chief editor of that edition. And I have a great deal of respect for the Egyptian people, but I don't think that Egypt can rely solely on the military for its future. And there are very bright Egyptians all over the world that I know and respect. And I think within Egypt too, we have the same situation as exists in Pakistan. You have brilliant people, hardworking people. You have a middle class that is keeping the country afloat. You have workers' remittances that are keeping the country afloat. All of this in spite of poor government. And so it's really a question of giving them the opportunity to strengthen the country and create a better future.
So coming to foreign policy, and we have a Biden administration coming in January to take charge of the United States, but from where President Obama left the U.S. as where he signed the Transatlantic Pacific Treaty, he sort of wanted to the Paris Climate Agreement, but we saw when with Trump coming in that the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. The Trans-Pacific Treaty was also the U.S. bowed out of it, and China just very recently has signed the RCEP agreement with member states of the TPP. So with China, emerging as a world leader of sorts, not only in climate change, but also, trying to dictate the terms of world trade as well. What do you see will the US role be in the coming 4 to 8 years, given where China, which used to be, for a very long time had this policy of non-intervention, not only in international conflicts, but used to keep itself away from even multilateralism. With China increasingly engaging in multilateral cooperation, and the US has been has ceded its space, do you see a conflict where the US and China come at loggerheads, or do you see US trying to perhaps be a runner-up in this race for the next 4 to 6 years?
Raza, nobody tries to be a runner-up. I think everyone tries to be number one. And there will be very powerful competition. I think the Chinese have the upper hand at the moment because they have a strong base of economic growth and decision-making. They also have the ability to look over the horizon in formulating policies, whether it is in the neighborhood through the what used to be the what is the Indo-Pacific, in which the Obama administration tried to counter through the TPP, and that Trump basically annulled, or in building relations in the US's own backyard in South America. The Monroe Doctrine was not applied by the United States because I think they were asleep at the wheel when China made deals with Chile and with other countries in South America for access to resources for very long periods to come. And they have done the same in Africa, where the competition has not been from America, but from India for trade and resource allocation from African countries. So this is going to be the competition. China's economy is probably going to be soon the largest economy in the world, if it isn't already. And if you exclude services, China already has exceeded, I think, the US in its trade relationships, even with India, with whom they've been involved in very aggressive actions against each other in the Himalayas. You're quite right. China has never actively tried to have a policy of sending troops overseas, although they've now started contributing to the UN peacekeeping forces, even in Afghanistan. I think they have sent medical personnel. But they had, if you recall, one very bad experience when they tried to move into Vietnam. And it was poorly managed, and the Vietnamese gave them a bloody nose. And that was the end of it. The Chinese did not follow through, and since then, they have not actually sent troops outside their border. I think that is something that will be consistent and predictable for the Chinese. They don't have a large navy, but they also are now developing their navy so that they can project force into the Indo-Pacific. But so is India. And Diego Garcia is at some point going to be in the news again when the British lease expires. And the rights of the people of Diego Garcia come into play in a court in Britain. And the US may then exit. And who do they hand it over to? Most likely to India. So there are going to be shifts on the regional chessboard across the globe. But there will be competition. I don't see conflict because China and the US are inextricably codependent in terms of trade and in terms of investments. And China holds US treasuries in large volume. They don't want the US economy to suffer because their investments suffer as a result. China also has an enormous diaspora population in Southeast Asia, in the Caribbean, in North America. Canada has had an enormous influx of people from Hong Kong, for instance, and from the mainland. So the world is shrinking, and I think smart governments, whether in Pakistan or India or China or America, are going to be able to use the diaspora much more effectively to assist in their efforts to build interlocking trade and economic relationships, because these are the relationships that are dominant. The inability of major powers, super weapons, to fight bushfires around the world has been proven by the Soviet Union and by the Americans in Vietnam and in Afghanistan and now in Africa too. So there will be a gradual retreat from those kind of interventions as we look to the future. These are kind of the scenarios that I can see. I don't have a crystal ball. If I did, I'd be a very rich man playing the stock market. But I can only offer you these scenarios.
But speaking of intervention, there's one, in our neighborhood. Do you see, where do you see the Doha peace process going? Uh, will the Biden administration actively work towards getting out of Afghanistan, or do you see a prolonged US presence there?
I think the way things are going now, there will probably be a slightly drawn out US presence, but only to the extent of protecting the Afghan government that is in Kabul currently and allowing them to have a successful intra-Afghan conversation that will produce some stability in the region. Pakistan is going to play a critical role in this because it is in Pakistan's selfish interest that there be stability in Afghanistan. If there is instability, there will be a transfer of populations again across the border with Pakistan, and Pakistan can't afford to have another influx of Afghans at this critical economic juncture, and also because of COVID, which is likely to persist for a while. So by all accounts, I think there will probably emerge some kind of an economic plan also for the region that involves Afghanistan and will have a continued presence. I mean, currently, the way the Trump administration is going, they're reducing the US presence so much that the allies, the coalition troops, are now going to be outnumbering the US presence on the ground. Not that 2,500 or 4,500 US troops can make a world of a difference, but it is the presence and then the economic relationship with Afghanistan that will keep the country afloat and allow it to settle its own affairs in a more measured manner. And Pakistan, I keep coming back to Pakistan. It's a large neighbor, it's an important trading partner, and it will have a desire to work with all Afghans, solely not the Pakhtuns, because that has been not a successful strategy for Pakistan. It has allowed India to move into what was known as the Northern Alliance and influence them much more than Pakistan was able to. So all of this means that there has to be enlightened self-interest at work, but also fleet-footed and clear thinking, so that you can have a policy that is long-term and is not relying on something that will emerge with results in the next 6 months or 1 year.
So there
I've lost you again, Raza.
there's a question that's come from, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, now.
Yeah, so there's a question that's come up from someone online, and they've asked that the changing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in the last 3-4 years, especially after the Yemen conflict, how do you see the shifting sands in the Middle East affecting Pakistan's relationship with the US and Pakistan's relationship with the Gulf states?
I'm not sure there's going to be a big difference in the US-Pakistan relationship because of what is happening in Saudi Arabia. However, I think there may be a slight shift in emphasis in the US-Saudi relationship over time. The Pakistan-Saudi relationship is an old relationship, and there are many reasons for it. Some of those reasons may be changing as we speak. So as a result of COVID, and as well as a change in the economy of Saudi Arabia, the types of workers that are needed in Saudi Arabia will shift. And so the reason, in my humble view, for the spike in the remittances from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states is that people are repatriating their savings in large amounts as a precursor to being sent back on a one-way ticket to the homeland. This is going to affect Pakistan. It is going to affect India and Bangladesh, particularly, because these countries need to be able to provide workers at a different level of training and education and experience. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states don't need ditch diggers and people that are manual laborers to the same extent that they did before. This is something that I predicted 10 years ago. And at the Atlantic Council, we went around trying to talk to people in the region and in the US to see if we could fund research into this phenomenon that we knew was unfolding. We found no one thinking about it. Even today, I don't see any evidence of people in Pakistan thinking about how to cope with the return of these workers. The other danger to Pakistan of this is going to be that with the exposure to Salafist Islam of these groups, that were the underclass in the Gulf and in the Arabian Peninsula, they are not going to find a very conducive atmosphere when they return home. And so they may end up creating another political upheaval in favor of a much more rigid Islamic view of life that may or may not accord with the changing mores inside Pakistani society. And this is going to create its own tensions and difficulties for Pakistan. The other big point, and this is an important one for Pakistan, is that it has Iran as an immediate neighbor and the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia as near neighbors. And because of these two important relationships, it's going to have to ride these two horses.
Yeah.
The famous circus analogy. It's very critical to maintain both these relationships because you don't want to have antagonism on your borders. And this is also potentially export fields for both Pakistan, for in Iran as well as in Saudi Arabia for Pakistan. So these are all the factors that are going to be at play. And again, I go back to my plea to the business community and to the middle class to get their act together and to build ties that go beyond what the governments are saying and doing, so that there are direct relationships and dependencies between the economies of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and the economy in Iran and Pakistan.
So I guess this will be a parting question because you've mentioned Saudi Arabia and Iran in this equation. We see a sort of sectarianism coming back to Pakistan over the last 1 or 2 years. We've also seen the rising of I won't like to use the word popular, but unfortunately it has become a political force, which is the TLP in Pakistan. It's emerged as a political force. Now, you and I, and probably most of our viewers, do know the origins of this political force. The very short-term, myopic objective of creating this force in 2017. And you've time and again, come back to how short-term thinking in Pakistan's civilian and military quarters at times has been. Do you think this attempt to fulfill the short-term goal is going to cost Pakistan in the long term?
Always, always. And this is something we have to learn from our history, that when you create these Frankenstein's monsters, they become independent actors and they get out of control, and then you try and distance yourself from them and it doesn't work. The only solution, in my view, is to have much more transparent and open public debates and discussions, and have Parliament play a greater role in this process also, so that the debate reflects the views of the people in general. Pakistan must celebrate its diversity. You can't slice and dice the population of Pakistan between Muslims and non-Muslims, and then within Muslims into different sects, and within sects into subsects. Who's a Barelvi and who's a Deobandi and who's a Naqshbandi and who's a Qadri, etc., etc. What Cyril Almeida once called the kind of salami approach to running the country. So it's very critical that these be avoided, because this will only divide and weaken Pakistan's polity. Pakistan must celebrate its diversity and build its economy and society on the fact that it is diverse and it has many different ethnic groups and sectarian groups and linguistic groups in it. And that the more you recognize and celebrate them and the more you discuss your differences in the open, the easier it is to resolve them through discussion and not through violence or through destructive public actions.
Thank you so much, sir. I guess that's it for today. Thank you so much for taking out the time. I know it's early morning in your part of the world, and for being so gracious with your time. It's been over an hour now, and I hope we can reach out to you again for another session, perhaps on a different topic, but perhaps the theme is going to be very similar. We are entangled in this sort of a web of Pakistan-US relations. But it's been a pleasure. I'm sure the students and everyone watching learned a lot. And please, for those who haven't, this book is available in Pakistan. You can go and buy this book, The Battle for Pakistan. It's a continuation of the earlier book, Crosswords, which Mr. Shuja Nawaz has authored. Should we expect another book anytime soon?
I think I'm probably going to take a little break and do some other writing, particularly more personal family history kind of writing, because I've been doing research on that. But the good news is that Oxford University Press is now reprinting Crosswords because copies had run out again. And I know that Liberty has reprinted The Battle for Pakistan. So for those of my friends who keep writing to me on my website, shujanawaz.com, or on Facebook, copies are available or will soon be available of both books inside the country. I thank you again, and I appreciate the fact that students at your university are interested enough to spend an hour or more with someone like me. I'm delighted to be part of your conversation because the future belongs to the youth in Pakistan. And I look forward to a bright future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I also look forward to having you and hosting you in Pakistan, in Lahore, so that I can also get this signed. But thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your time, and take care of yourself.